Welcome to the Point. As we get near the end of summer, we start thinking about people going back to school and about the legislature going back into session. Senator Roger Victory is my guest, and we are talking about just that. Senator, so much has happened over the last 18 months. The pandemic has changed the trajectory of state government in many ways. It has certainly changed the relationship between majority Republicans and the Democratic governor. So there is a lot to unpack here this morning, but I want to start with this. We know that COVID variants are hospitalizing more people, and we know that there are some areas that will require, some school districts that will require masks when the students go back to school. Others are going to leave it as an option. So as a government, function of government, what, if anything, should the state be doing to advise or to guide these school boards all across the state that are autonomous? I mean, they have local control, but when we think about back to school, what is it that the state could or should not be doing?
Well, one is, Rick, there's been lessons learned. We're in a different place than we were a year ago. After some aspects, we have the shots. Good number of people have been vaccinated. I myself have received the shot. And that is one of the protocols right there for those who are capable and able to have the shot. Then going forward, we also learn when you force something or make it a mandate, you lose a lot of time. I always encourage and articulate, let's use best practices. Let's use what we've learned in the past, implement that, and then move this forward, because we do know the rise of the Delta variant is coming forward. We see that even in our local community, and let's be smart about it. So I encourage everybody to be smart about it, use best practices, and build on what we learned in the past.
One of the issues, and I think I used this example last week, but my middle schooler is getting ready to go back to school, and at orientation it became clear to me that there are children in that school, those students, there are a number of them that are 12 and over that can be vaccinated, but there are also a fair amount that are under 12 that can't be vaccinated. So within the same school population, you have kids, and I'm not saying they are or aren't, I don't know whether they are, but that could be, and kids that can't be. And so then you worry about if somebody is carrying a variant and somebody who's not wearing a mask. When you talk about encouragement, and I take your point seriously about mandates as well, but does that create confusion in those settings for parents who say to their kids, you don't have to wear a mask, and parents who say you must wear a mask, and then you've got all of those kids together in school, and we know what peer pressure is like.
Right, but also a mandate can create confusion too, because then there's going to be religious exemptions and this exemptions. In the meantime, while you're vetting all those micro exemptions throughout the system, you're keeping the eye off the bigger ball. And for these administrators, just putting some common sense regulation in place. Let's be smart about, so if there's keep distancing, best practices. We learn a lot and implement that versus just getting into that where sometimes government doesn't get this done right. I think the empowerment of the individual is probably the biggest strength in how we can prevent COVID.
When you think about what government has done over the past 18 months, and I know that you and many of your Republican colleagues had great problems with some of the things that the governor did. But here we are again, we're almost 18 months into this, and looking back, what is the role of government in general now as we continue with a pandemic that's still active with variants? And we talk about the Delta variant, and certainly no medical expert am I, but it seems likely there could be other variants too, because that's what viruses do, is they mutate and change. But what should the state be doing? What will you be advocating for the state to be doing as COVID response continues, because it's not over?
There's two areas, short term and long term. Let's focus on short term right now. There's certain areas the state government has dropped the ball. Secretary of State, the delivering of basic government services, getting your car registration done, getting those appointments. There are some things you just literally have to do that in person. It's not happening. I've been spending a lot of time with our constituents hearing their frustrations, and that's why we even introduced a bill allowing some of these simple transactions to be done at your local car dealership. taking that workload off. So that is a short-term example right there. Also, the Unemployment Insurance Agency, a disaster. That is something that actually I did some work in the past on when they accused 30-some thousand people of fraud. That was just a precursor, because now that computer systems continues to spew out these letters, making these accusations, and there's no person there to actually answer that. So I've been working with our constituents on those areas. So those are two prime examples. And then long term, we got to make sure that there's going to be talent available to, as this economy comes out post-COVID. We see a lot of potential growth right here in West Michigan, but that growth is going to need those men and women trained, able to do that job and function and grow our economy here in West Michigan. Along with other things, just making sure we get a balanced budget passed through this process, making sure we're invested for not just us currently, but for the next generation.
We're going to get to the budget in the second half of the show, but I want to focus in on something you talked about, and that is the worker shortage. And this is almost a universal problem in every sector. I talk to people on a regular basis, and I know you're heavily involved in agriculture. I assume that you've experienced on the farm. We look at restaurants and any number of businesses. Literally, I have experienced walking into a restaurant and they say, "I'm sorry, we can't seat you for another 45 minutes, even though the restaurant is only partially full. They don't have staff." I'm not sure we can get at all of the core reasons for that, but how do we get people, like you said, trained, back up to speed and get people back into the workforce? Because it is a bit of a surprise to me that perhaps the biggest economic problem coming out of this pandemic isn't about businesses that have closed, and there certainly have been those, but it's now trying to keep the ones that are still open by getting enough workers there. How do you do that?
Well, Rick, we could do an entire show on just what went wrong, and I could have a whole litany against what the governor did wrong and those aspects, but we can discuss that at a later time. But I like your question, how do we go forward? And I think that's what the people of West Michigan say, how do we go forward on this? Because we are still reviewing what was wrong. But how do we go? It's a lot about training, making sure our schools, one is make sure our schools are open, making sure, because we lost almost a whole year there. So there's time we got to make up on that process. But making sure those educational opportunities are available for all the students, because some will be going on to higher education, the K through, the college experience, the university experience. But one thing we have done well in West Michigan here is invested in our career and technical training component, vocational training. And that's something I was an advocate long before I even held elected office. I serve on an advisory committee at the Career Line Tech Center. And we've been receiving dividends from that investment. And that's why I talk about how do you take his current budget and make investments. And these investments, like in career training at these tech centers, we got to be focused on it. Because we also, just met with the fire chiefs here not too long ago. We have a hard time even recruiting people to serve in the fire services and the training involved in that. Sometimes I believe we can get that training done at an earlier level, then we'll create a bigger pool for those that want to be firefighters, those other areas too. So that's just one example where we got to be focused on the future, because it's about talent and developing that talent to fulfill this growing economy we have here in West Michigan.
There are a lot of differences from one administration to the next, but one constant between the Snyder administration and the Whitmer administration is that they both have advocated for more training for skilled trades and in any number of areas to encourage young people in high school to get some training as they move forward, whatever they choose to do. They may even still choose to go on to college, but to have some sort of skill. And I know that the education budget has already been done, and it was the biggest ever. But there's money in there for some of that, isn't there?
Yeah, there's money there. Another aspect we got to be focusing on, we could put all the money into that system, but there's a limited number of instructors in these vocational programs, because we're competing with the private sector. So as we got a robust building economy going on, we have to compete with that robust building and construction economy to recruit those candidates to serve and to teach at that level. And with that there, you have to have those skills of that specific trade and that educational experience. So that we got to remind ourselves there's a limited pool, and we got to make sure that pipeline is available for those instructors to be working into. And I do see that pipeline for those instructors is very limited, and we're going to be struggling with that.
One of the areas you and I were talking about before we came up to the studio stems from your position as chair of the Judiciary Committee, and there has been conversation, and you even related to me how there's conversation outside of Michigan about some of the things that we're doing with criminal justice reform here in the state that people are taking note of, a very positive vein. But tied in with shortages of workers, we were talking about getting people into public safety. You mentioned fire, obviously the police forces. That's another area where the state is going to have to get pretty proactive to be competitive.
Yes, this is coming down the pike, and unless we address this head on, we're going to be paying a huge price on it. There's this dialogue of defunding the police. I say we got to flip the script on that component. It should be articulated, how do we invest into our police forces? If we are not investing, and it's through recruiting, training, and retaining the best and the brightest. Other states, they took a knee-jerk reaction, and it's a disaster. And we're actually bringing people into the state of Michigan because they're leaving that career path. There's also an element of respect for those positions. Pay is one component to it, but pay can't compensate for those serving that line of work, and there's not that basic respect. 20 years ago, those officers and those police officers had that certain level of, we knew a police officer, and you have respect on that component. That has been eroding, and we have to change that component too. Also, we got to make sure they're doing their job too. So there's got to be accountability, respect, and compensation. And if we put that together, I believe we can put ourselves in a better place in the next decade.
But you did talk about, and I think it's a point well taken, certainly those women and men who provide those services should be treated with respect, but they too have to have the level of training and accountability so that respect is well earned. And that's part of what created this whole environment in the first place.
Correct.
And so that too will fall to the state, and it will fall largely to your committee. And that's one of the budgets we'll talk about when we get back in just a few minutes. But before we take a break, when you, and I don't expect you, I said I wasn't going to play a medical expert, and I don't expect you to either, but as you look forward, every conversation I have with people is about everybody going back to school, everything being more normal, even if we're wearing face coverings. Are you concerned as a state senator, as a resident of Ottawa County, that as all of these kids head back into school and start down this path, that this variant or another is going to disrupt this school year as the last two school years have been disrupted? Or are you more confident we're now at a point where we can resume something that feels like normal?
There will be issues. There always will be issues. But as I go back to, I stated earlier, we have lessons learned, implement those lessons learned, and there's going to be disruptions. There always will be disruptions. We have disruptions even in the past when we had outbreak of flu. And those are classic cases. We have shut schools down because of flu outbreaks in other areas. And this may be a part of it going forward. But there again, let's put best practices in place, be smart about it, and we can tackle this problem.
Senator Roger Victory is my guest. As we continue our conversation, we're going to talk about the budget. Now, here we are, almost to the 1st of September. That leaves only a few weeks until the budget deadline. And when we come back, we're going to get your take on where we are. All that is next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Senator Roger Victory is our guest. And Senator, in addition to all of the other work you do, it's interesting, there are only 38, well right now only 36 members of the Senate, so you end up on a lot of committees. It's not like over in the House where there's 110 and people get spread out a little bit more. So you have a lot of areas of responsibility. Being chairman of the Judiciary is one of them, but you also are on agriculture appropriations, and something near and dear to your heart and important to your district. But all of the budgets, with the exception of education, are yet to be done. And one of the hallmarks of the last administration with a Republican governor and a Republican legislature is the budgets were always done relatively early in the summer. Now, the good news is for schools that the education budget is already done. Their budget year starts July 1st, so it's important for them to have an idea what that's going to be. And perhaps the even better news, it's the biggest ever education budget that's been done, because there are going to be a lot of challenges for schools after being disrupted for a year and a half. So all of that's the good news. Now, I don't want to say it's bad news, but what is the news on the rest of the budget? Because there's still a lot of heavy lifting there.
There definitely is, Rick, but we have to get this right. We have one shot at this here, and so there's a lot of dollars coming available through this COVID relief. And when you have $1 million available, there's $1 billion request. So there's a couple $1 billion, and so you can translate that to all the requests out there. So we got to make sure that these requests are vetted through, and from my viewpoint in budgets I control, is that these dollars, how does it benefit not for us today, but for us 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? How does that pay a dividend to those who are actually going to be paying this bill? It's not you and I that will be paying this bill, it's our future generations. So there's an opportunity to get this done right, and so I look at things we invest into such things as infrastructure that will pay a dividend back. There's some things that we can just get our financial balance sheet of the state of Michigan in shape. No, there was a lot of discussions on that just 10 years ago, but it seemed to be kind of a moot point. The issues are still there. We got to tackle these, and I think we have an opportunity to get this done right, and that's why we're taking our time, because we know we have one bite at the apple at this.
When you talk about one bite at the apple, we're looking at one time, what we believe will be one-time federal money, and a bunch of it. And
huge amount.
The problem is that if you plug that money into your budget as a regular line item, then there would be some desire, some need to try to fund that again next year, and that federal money won't be there. So you have to look at that as an investment, or at least I assume you have to look at that as an investment that sustains itself, that doesn't force the tax rolls to continue to backfill that. How difficult is that to take that money and say, all right, we're going to use it now to spend on this, but in the future there's not going to be funding for whatever Project X is?
It is a difficult situation. That's why we're still negotiating on this here. If it was easy, we could have that done, dot the I's, cross the T's, and put together. And that's why I continue to have robust discussions on this situation, working with Chair Stamas. Chair Stamas has been a brilliant chairman to work with. He gets the idea. He shares my personal values and regarding investments on this. So hopefully here we'll have this thing completed in the near future. But it is, again, many ask, but we got to get this thing right.
Final question about the budget. Is the negotiation between the Senate and the House, or is it between the legislature and the governor, or is it both?
Both. Robust discussion among all the parties.
Oh, right. We'll leave that at that. Let's talk about infrastructure. You brought that up just a minute ago. One of the themes, again, that carried over from the last administration to this administration, and I would point out probably every administration I've covered, is better roads, better bridges, getting things rebuilt. That's expanded with the new realization that our broadband coverage in the state is simply not adequate, because for some students, we were fortunate enough that our kids were in an area where we had pretty good internet service, but 6 houses away, there were people who couldn't necessarily do online schooling. Now, as a parent, and I suspect as a legislator, we hope that doesn't happen again, but still the need for that is there. So when it comes to infrastructure, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen in Washington, but what do you do as a state? Obviously, the first budget year was a disaster with the governor ended up vetoing a bunch of things and bonding for some money to work on roads. There's still more need. What does that look like from your position?
Well, I look at infrastructure, I look at broadband, I look at water issues, and I also look at the roads issues, or specifically bridges. I think that is one area. The bridges have been neglected. There's 400 bridges out there that aren't part of the MDOT system, but are in the local municipalities. They're kind of orphan bridges, because these local municipalities don't have the money to maintain these or get those up to grade. I have a couple of those in Ottawa County. There's a package of bills out there that Wayne Smith, Senator Smith from the Transportation Chair, which I vice chair, $1.5 billion address that. This is another example that when we get this taken care of, then we grow our economy because we have this transportation. Broadband is another issue. I was just up in UP in Marquette. There's a prime example of a rural kind of a community out there, but they invested in broadband a decade ago, and that city is busting at the seams. Robust economic development, a new hospital health situation there, and it's just go, go, go because of those investments. I believe we need to invest in what we call a trunk line broadband. The state puts that investment in, and then from there, private entities can work off of that, because we can't do all, but what is the best role for that? And then comes the water. We know how the issues of water, how we make sure that a reliable water source is available. Some of our municipalities are struggling with that. I have some communities in Grand Haven, et cetera. And then also even from, erosion issues that we've seen. We had a lot of lakeshore erosion. There's some prices, some heavy lifting to do to retrofit those.
When you look at the government money that we were talking about a moment ago, and I said I was going to talk more about budget, but you've got some of that money. Is some of that available to do some of those what could be considered maybe not one-time things? If you talk about fixing a bridge, you may have to fix it again, but might not have to do it for a lot of years. Is some of that money available for things like that?
Yeah, but it's also, remember, these federal dollars have prescriptions, and so there's some aspects. So that dollar has to be utilized this way, but then also frees up another dollar to be utilized in a different fashion. So that's why this budget process we talked is still ongoing, because it's not as clear cut and easy as it would appear on paper per se, because it is a matter of using those proper dollars for those proper uses, but then how do we leverage other dollars to address some of these needs?
I want to finish up by talking about something I talked with Senator Brinks on the show last week, and appreciating that you are not necessarily impartial when it comes to redistricting. But what is your view, what is your thought about where we are with the redistricting? This is the first time that we've used the Independent Commission. And they have had some problems of their own because they haven't had census numbers until just this week. But this will redraw every Senate district, every House district, and every congressional district in the state. We'll have one fewer congressional district, so at least one member who is currently serving in Washington will not be after the 2022 elections. What is your thought in the time that we have left about the process to the degree that you have observed it?
Well, one of my initial concern is our lack of representation on that council from West Michigan. We have a representative from Battle Creek and somebody from Traverse City. But as the fastest growing region in the state of Michigan, where is our voice on that commission? So that's a little alarming at the beginning of that whole component. And with that, this commission has to keep in mind, this is the fastest growing part of the state, and making sure that that is well represented. Do not cut and slice and dice this area up, making sure that we keep our communities of interest, keeping such as Ottawa County together as much as possible, even though we are above our population cap, so there has to be some component there. But we cannot just make this look like a bunch of spaghetti here on the west side of the state, because we are the fastest growing and we need that representation.
When you talk about Ottawa County and above the cap, so you're talking about the Senate seat?
Yeah, the Senate seat,
Yeah, so you'll have two.
Yep.
Senators.
There would be a partial.
Yeah. And that could be drawn into Kent County, it could be drawn into Ottawa County, it could be drawn into Muskegon County. It can go a lot of different ways.
That is correct. You notice how the focus is usually on my side, and there's other component, but that's my center of attention at that point. Yep.
All right, Senator, we're going to leave it there. I thank you for coming in and doing this.
As always, Rick.
And I'm sure we'll talk more about the budget in the coming weeks. And we're going to be right back with a final thought next, To the Point. Starting next week, the U.S. House will be back in session. They'll be looking at some of those infrastructure bills in Washington that could have a major impact on us here in Michigan. We'll be following that. And in just a couple of weeks, the legislature will head back to Lansing. They'll be dealing with the budget. And as we've discussed on this show, there is a lot to do and a relatively short time to get it done. That new budget has to be in place by the end of September. All of those things are what we'll be watching every Sunday morning and Saturday afternoon as well when you join us right here, To the Point.